Tunisia, March 1943. A Churchill Mac III sat outside a Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers workshop at Mejez El Bab, its hull scarred with fresh weld beads that ran in uneven, almost ugly lines across the glacis plate. The steel bolted and welded onto it hadn't come from a factory. It had come from a knocked-out German half-track, cut into rough plates with an oxyacetylene torch and hammered into shape by hand. On paper, this was everything a tank engineer was trained to avoid: mismatched metal, unmeasured thickness, welds laid by a man working from instinct rather than a specification sheet. Yet 3 weeks later, that same tank took a 50mm round from a Panzer III on its front quarter, and the crew walked away. The scrap steel hadn't matched the armor's temper, its hardness, or its metallurgy. It worked anyway. And the reason it worked reveals something the war's official armor programs took years to fully absorb. Protection wasn't just about what the steel was made of. It was about where it sat, how it was angled, and what it did to a shell in the fraction of a second before impact. The Churchill tank arrived in North Africa already carrying a reputation problem. Compared to the German Panzer IV or the upgunned Tigers appearing by late 1942, it was slow, barely 15 mil/8 on a good road, undergunned with its early 2-pounder main armament, and mechanically temperamental, prone to track and transmission failures in the desert heat. British armor doctrine, shaped by interwar thinking and reinforced by early defeats at Gazala and Tobruk, held that survivability came from speed and maneuver. Get out of the way, don't get hit. Standard military thinking emphasized mobility over mass, on the theory that a tank that couldn't be hit didn't need extra steel. Critics in the Tank Corps called the Churchill's 102 mm frontal hull armor on the Mark III overkill for a vehicle that couldn't outrun anything. They were right that it was slow. They were wrong about what that slowness would end up buying it. What actually mattered was where the Churchill was going to fight. In the close, broken terrain of Tunisia's hill country, and later in the Italian mountains around Cassino, tanks weren't dueling at 1,500 meters across open desert the way they had at Alamein. They were crawling through olive groves, along sunken lanes, and up terraced slopes at ranges sometimes under 200 meters, where a Churchill's poor speed barely mattered because nothing could maneuver quickly in that ground anyway. What mattered there was whether the tank could take a hit and keep its crew alive long enough to fire back or reverse out. The Churchill's designers, working from the I tank infantry support lineage, rather than the cruiser tank tradition, had built it heavy and slow on purpose. A tank meant to crawl alongside infantry through exactly this kind of terrain, absorbing fire rather than dodging it. The secret was in its intended job, not its top speed. The scrap steel program that grew up around REME workshops in 1943 and 1944 wasn't an official Vauxhall design change. It was field expedient, driven by fitters and mechanics who saw crews coming back with holes in their tanks and worked out, unit by unit, what stopped the next round. The technical reality was crude but effective. Spare track links, roughly 6 inches wide, and 1.5 inches thick of manganese steel, welded or bolted onto the hull front and turret sides in overlapping rows. Salvaged plate from wrecked German and Italian vehicles, cut down and tack welded at standoff distances of 4 to 6 inches from the main armor. Sandbags stacked and wired on where steel wasn't available, adding mass and disrupting shape-charged jets even though they did nothing against solid shot. None of this matched the hardness or ballistic quality of the Churchill's own cast and rolled homogeneous armor. What it did was force an incoming round, particularly the hollow charge projectiles fired by German Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks, which depended on a precise standoff distance to focus their jet. To detonate early, against the wrong surface, at the wrong range, the appliqué steel didn't need to be metallurgically perfect. It needed to be in the way. Soldiers writing home and in unit diaries from the Italian campaign described the difference in blunt terms. A troop report from the 51st Royal Tank Regiment, operating Churchills near Ortona in the winter of 1943, recorded a tank taking a Panzerfaust strike on the applied track-link armor at roughly 30 meters, a range at which the weapon's heat warhead should have punched clean through 200 mm of conventional steel equivalent. The jet burned through the spare track link, lost coherence in the air gap behind it, and only scorched the underlying hull plate. The crew reported ringing ears and a dented interior stowage bin. Nothing worse. Compare that to accounts of Standard Armor Sherman's hit at similar range in the same campaign, where a clean Panzerfaust strike routinely meant a brewed-up tank and crew casualties. The standoff gap, improvised from nothing more than scrap and imagination, was doing the job that a purpose-designed spaced armor system would later do on the Sherman Jumbo and on post-war composite designs, years before anyone formalized the principle in a manual. This wasn't accidental, even though it looked like desperate improvisation from the outside. REME fitters attached to armored regiments were, by 1943, some of the most experienced field engineers in the British Army, and many had spent years watching exactly how tanks failed in combat, not in gunnery trials, but in actual mud, actual heat, and actual panic. What looked good in Chertsey and Lulworth trials, where the Churchill's armor was tested against known ammunition at known ranges on a flat range, didn't always predict what happened when a crew took fire from 3 directions at once in a village street with German infantry 50 meters away. Commanders weren't clinging to the extra weight and drag penalty of scrap armor out of stubbornness or ignorance of ballistic theory. They knew that a functioning tank with a bit less speed and a lot more standoff protection kept more crews alive than a lighter, faster tank that lost its fight in the first exchange. Battlefields aren't gunnery ranges. They're chaotic, close-range, 3-dimensional problems where the tank that gets the second shot wins, not the tank that theoretically has the better armor-to-weight ratio on a spec sheet. The workshop-level program also solved a supply problem that official armor programs couldn't. Factory-produced applique armor kits, when they existed at all, had to be shipped from Britain, took months to arrive, and were rationed by priority. A REME fitter with a cutting torch, an arc welder, and a knocked-out German vehicle 20 meters away could produce equivalent protection in an afternoon. The German testimony captured after actions in Italy is instructive here. Prisoners from the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, interrogated near Cassino in early 1944, reported specifically avoiding engaging reinforced Churchills at ranges under 100 meters with Panzerfausts, preferring to wait for towed anti-tank guns instead, an implicit admission that the improvised armor had changed their tactical calculus. Even though, from a German ordnance officer's perspective, the scrap steel welded onto a British tank should have been battlefield trash, not protection. What made this work wasn't any single feature, but rather the compounding of several imperfect solutions layered together. The Churchill's inherently thick base armor, chosen for an infantry support role rather than a speed-focused cruiser doctrine, a fighting environment in Tunisia and Italy that neutralized the tank's mobility disadvantage while rewarding its survivability, and a REME repair culture willing to bolt scrap steel onto a war-winning weapon, rather than waiting for a factory solution that might arrive too late to matter. None of it would have satisfied a peacetime ordnance board. All of it satisfied the only metric that counted in the field, crews who came home. The deeper principle, one that armor designers would spend the following decades relearning and formalizing into deliberate spaced armor and composite armor doctrine, was that protection is a system, not a material. A plate of scrap steel torn off a dead enemy vehicle and welded on with more enthusiasm than precision could still defeat a purpose-built anti-tank weapon, provided it was placed with an understanding, however informally arrived at, of how that weapon actually worked. The Churchill's reputation as an obsolete, underpowered tank persisted in post-war histories written by men who compared spec sheets. The men who'd fought in one through the hedgerows and rubble of Italy generally didn't share that verdict. To them, the slow tank with the ugly welds on the front was the one still running at the end of the day.